This conference will now be recorded.
I'm glad you recorded that after I started.
It's Tuesday, July 11th, 5:31. Josh, please do the roll call.
Sure. Tyson Blatchford, Lloyd Colston,
I'm here.
Brendan Jellings. Here. Ian Kuhn,
Here.
Kyle Lewis, Cody Richardson.
Here.
Dottie Smith, Tom Wheatley.
Here. Is there anyone online?
Nope. Dottie shouldn't be here though. Probably just ran a minute or two late.
Well, there's no one here, so we'll begin with public comments. Consent agenda number 1, meeting minutes for June 13th, 2023. Is there any opposition?
Move we approve.
Second. Meeting minutes for June 13th. Approved. Let's move on to considerations. Zoning regulations amendment discussion.
Oh, wait just a second for whoever that is. That's Dottie.
Hello, Donnie.
We'll save you a seat.
Just do roll call.
Well, improve the minutes, I guess, too.
Went through the minutes. Oh, you started early.
Have the issue with last month's meeting minutes,
I don't think so.
discussion on that.
All right. So this is a nice light meeting. Not stressful like the last one was. It was not bad. So we started this discussion last month about the different amendments, and we went over the subdivision portion of the amendments that I proposed. So now I wanted to shift gears to zoning. I propose to split this into 2 meetings. I think it'll just be a better discussion if we do that. And the second one is has a lot of substance to it, even though there's only a couple articles, but it has a lot of stuff to it. This, what I propose today, is mostly just focused on the individual districts. So it should go pretty quick. Just depends how many questions you have. So today it may sound like a lot when I say this, but we're going to go through the first 18 articles. Not all of them have changes. In fact, number 1 doesn't even have changes. And then, like I said, next month we can go over the rest. If we decide not to go through everything tonight, we can catch up whatever we left off. And then we'll look at the zoning map as well next time. All right. So I think, does everybody have a copy of those proposed changes worksheet thing? Okay. So I'm just going to go through each article by article, and this time I labeled the article so I'll remember where we're at. So like I said, a lot of these articles are pretty minor, but there is some substance to a few of them. So I just wanted to go over each of those changes that I proposed. So Article 1, no changes. That pretty much is just the article that introduces what the regulations are and why they exist. So wouldn't want to change that very often. In Article 2, a big part of what's in there is definitions. And there's a few changes that I propose to make to those. First of all, fence. What I proposed there would be to more thoroughly define fencing in the fencing section of the regulations in section 20-9, which is something we get you next week or next month. I also, as a practice, don't like to have regulation in the definitions, and that's kind of what happened there. So it's fairly simplified definition of fence is what would be left, which is kind of what we're looking for. permanent wall foundation, the reason we even touched that one is because the building official and I are trying to figure out the best way to deal with manufactured homes. And so we really looked at foundations for those. And so we really looked at this definition. And actually, I think we've just been kind of misinterpreting what it's saying. The only thing that we really changed to this is we added what the depth would be, or it needs to be, and that's right out of the code, the International Residential Code. So he suggested we put that in there. That's it. Short-term rental, that's a brand new term. In the comprehensive plan, it was suggested that we do something with those because they are there and we have no kind of control over it at all. I'm not proposing very many regulations, but I think it's good to define what it is. And then when we get to Article 6, I can show you what little I did put in there. But basically, it's any kind of dwelling unit that's used for less than 30 days. It's kind of a transient thing.
Josh, why is it there? I mean, we've just done fencing and permanent wall, and then we go back to some other stuff. Why did you put short-term rental there?
It's just alphabetical. This is just the definitions. This isn't just alphabetical.
Okay.
So what I did here on this guide, which is why you're probably asking that question, I'm just shortening it. The only thing that I've changed is what's appearing in here. So if you're looking at Article 2, the full version, you would see where that shows up.
So it's other words defined other than these three.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's like 10 pages worth of different definitions in that article. And the last one that I was going to touch was site distances. And at first glance, you might wonder, well, don't you need to define that? Well, you do, but it's pretty well defined in Article 20. And part of the issue with this, again, there's regulation in the definitions with this, and it doesn't completely match what's in the regulations. And so I just propose totally eliminating that so there's not so much confusion. And I actually added one thing from this to the regulation. You might see that next time. So it's not that site distances aren't important, or we call it corner visibility in the other section. So that's another reason why I struggled with that term. But I'm just proposed taking it out so we don't have to have that problem with the regulations not matching up. There's a few other places that Bob mentioned that there's a conflict between different spots in the code, and so I propose to eliminate the conflicting part. So any other questions on definitions, or have any concerns with the ones I changed? Okay. So these next two articles are very minor changes, but they're kind of important ones. Article 3 gives a listing of the different districts, and in another section within that article, it tells us how to define what the boundaries are and the different interpretations of the boundaries on the zoning map. I made two minor changes to Article 3. One of them was in the opening paragraph, it says that the city is divided into a certain number of districts. I don't think it's necessary to put the number of the districts, and you have to change it every time you change that, because the table of the districts is right underneath it. And so that was just for my sake, make sure that I don't miss that if we ever were to add or subtract a district in the future. And the district that's being affected is, of course, the countryside district. In the comp plan, we recommended removing that district because it doesn't have any purpose without extraterritorial zoning. It's meant to be what's called a cluster subdivision district, where like all the buildings and the subdivision plat are kind of grouped together and they're surrounded by a whole bunch of land. We didn't have a reason to do that inside the city limits. That would be covered by the R1 district. So That just removes it from the list. And then Article 4 is kind of an expansion on Article 3. It tells you the intent of each one of the districts. Well, again, if we eliminate the countryside district, we don't need to know the intent of a district that doesn't exist. And so this would just simply remove that section of Article 4 in its entirety and then just reserve it so we don't have to renumber everything. And then, of course, we have to edit the header and that kind of thing, but that's not a big thing. I'm assuming nobody has any questions about that because we've already talked about removing that district before. So Article 5, this agricultural district, didn't see a reason to change anything in that district, so there's no changes there. Article 6, there is a few changes. That is the residential districts. That's R1, R2, R3. And there's a couple changes. There's a change to the table in each of these main districts. There's a use table that tells you if a certain use is permitted or if it's conditional use in that appropriate district or if it's not allowed at all. And so I made really just that one minor change. I did on the dwelling section, I took that back out where it says modular home on number 7. Single family, it doesn't matter what it is. It's either single family, 2 family, or 3 family. We don't care really what kind of structure it is. We've defined modular home. We've defined residential design manufactured home. That's in the definitions. I didn't change those. So they're there. There's really not a reason to have that in there. Originally, I put it in there the last time we did a big revision. But in practice, it's just not necessary. And then the new use that I added was that short-term rentals that we just defined. And then it adds that that's referring to Airbnbs or VRBO or whatever. And the proposal I had was to make them be permitted in the R3 district and a conditional use in the R2 district. The conditions that could possibly come up if somebody was to request that would be how long they can stay there, how many guests are going to be in that particular home. If the owner occupies the house, for the most part, it's like primary residence. Those are the kind of things that would probably come up if somebody requested one of those. And then I thought about it, adding it into the R1 as well. I don't know. Does anybody have an opinion about those things, where they're at?
Yes. R1, for the most part of I can only think of a rare exception of an Airbnb that I stayed at that would not meet R1. And that was a camp that the cabins were rented out individually. So how you would address that, and I don't know of any cabins that would be Airbnb criteria in Arc City. But I think Airbnbs and the like would be appropriate under R1 because they are residential. And as a potential Airbnb renter, if I were to rent my house, it would only be while I was not living in it, be it 2 weeks or longer. So I think R1 would be an appropriate spot.
You think it should be conditional though?
It is commercial use.
So you're saying yes, it should be
No.
that it shouldn't be a conditional use?
No, I don't even like it. I don't like the idea of R1. I like more restrictions on, more oversight. It's like an abbreviated motel.
Mm-hmm. That's initially why I didn't put it in that district. Where we're seeing them is primarily in the R2, R3, because there's the one on Chestnut.
I mean, we have several.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's kind of varied a little bit. I think some people have tried it out for a little bit and then pulled it back because it didn't work the way they wanted. So I could see R2 and R3 all day long. I just left the R2 one there so that we could have a little bit tighter rein on that particular district, and then try to focus them in this downtown core area. We talked about that a little bit last month about that R3 district. That's where, well, trying to think that Chestnut, which zoning that is, but.
Where are our districts? We have a map that shows us what each area is.
Yeah, in fact, I have it in the packet today. I guess I'll have a quick, easy way to it. It's the last page anyways. So this is the zoning map. And so the colors, the blues are the residential. So this lightest shade is the R1, this medium one is R2, and then the darker is R3. So for instance, that.
So we have very little R1 as it is.
Yeah, and they're, like the areas east of the river are all R1. So, and honestly, that's probably an area where people would not want it, if I understand that neighborhood enough.
Yeah.
So there'd be more issues in those not friends, but you know what I mean, in the outer reaches, and there'd be less of an issue in this core district. So it does look like that one that's on Chestnut is somewhere in here.
Yeah.
Is in the R3. So.
What's the yellow?
Public.
Hmm?
Public.
Okay.
So that's government owned, basically.
Oh, school.
Yep.
Yeah, school. Yeah. So I like what you've done.
So is there conditional means they have to get a permit?
Yeah, conditional would be just, they'd have to come for you, basically. And you would go through and just go through a process like you normally would for conditional use permit. And that gives a chance for the public to weigh in and say, I'm concerned about this, and they can kind of go back and forth, just like we normally do with a conditional use.
So we don't need to add anything to that process. The process is
Yeah, it's already
there
there.
and doesn't need anything added to this.
You know, what you could do is actually create a section that defines what conditions are supposed to happen for these.
Yes.
And I didn't propose that, but we could always add a little section in there that says what we're looking for, if there's any concern. If you're in a bigger city or a tourist town, then they have these, I don't remember what city it was, but there was a city I looked at, it just had pages and pages of regulations that they had to go through. But that was in an area where they had a lot of problems with them. And, for instance, throwing parties and stuff and really causing problems to the neighbors.
And that would be a reason that I would put Airbnbs in a conditional R1, because if my neighbor, for example, wants to have a home away property, if it's conditional use in R1, then I get to say, maybe not.
Right, but as it's proposed today, it wouldn't even be allowed at all.
Okay,
Like they wouldn't even be able to request it,
okay.
because if it doesn't show up a letter in that box, I would just, if somebody came to me and asked about it, I'd say, no, you just can't have it there.
Yeah. I think there's some areas that, I guess, show me what is all R1? It seems like there could be some options that may make sense in R1.
So what, Timber Lane would be one. There's some areas along 8th Street here that are R1s.
My house would be one.
Your house would be in the R2.
Okay,
It's like right in here, close to Kansas, isn't it?
it's up in the Circle Drive area.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, that's the R2. Yeah, you're right.
Is it a lighter blue?
A little too.
The blues look similar.
Yeah, it doesn't, when you put it up on here, sometimes you can't
It's like
really see
more
it.
gray blue.
Yeah. Yeah.
So out east of town, the entire area, you said,
Yeah, where did mouse go? So like Country Club Estates is R1, and then all of Crestwood, Oakcrest, that
Yeah,
whole
you're
area.
on one.
Yeah, yours would be R1.
And I can see the pushback from business owners who, because we have rental property scarcity, buying up rental properties, rehabbing them, and making vacation homes out of them. And my vacation rental might be 6 months at a time.
Well, the way, this is 30 days, the way it's
30 days
written.
or less. This is the only place at 30 days or less.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know, I guess I picture some of those houses that are on 10 acres that they're not even near anybody. There's some out there that has some distance that, so you absolutely have no option to even ask for it. I mean, I think it's not popular yet. I guess if I'm going to the VRBO, a lot of times I want to stay in the nice area of town if I'm going someplace.
Usually people that stay in those want access to
Yeah,
town
I think it's kind
facilities.
of two different things. We're not necessarily a vacation place. There's some people out there with some distance that, well, I mean, so we have a place over at Table Rock, and they're like the opposite. You don't do VRBO unless you have, if you're like close knit, your neighbors don't want you, random people in and out right next to them, you got a big chunk of land, then they'll probably approve. It's like, you're not bothering anybody, you're distance from people, so I think that's kind of where I'm thinking. But just thought,
And I didn't see the 30 days in the,
That was that in the definition.
okay.
So back on page 4. I don't know if it's page 4 in your package, probably not. Page 1. I guess I don't have numbers on this.
You could put it in R1, put it under conditional, and then the neighbors have a say.
you still have to come here.
You know,
That's
so
the nice thing
if you want to
about it.
do that, I
It's
mean,
conditional, there's not absolutely no way.
it's still probably far-fetched if you're got neighbors that don't want it. But at least they have an option that way. It's not hurting a darn thing. I just don't foresee it getting super popular in our city
No, it's
because we don't really have, we're not a destination.
It almost scares me to even put it in here because we've done that before. But because we do have them, it would be nice to have, a little bit of control. There's some cases where cities have said, well, you can only have one in a certain area and the next one has to be 500 feet from it or something like that. Now, again, it didn't propose a regulation like that, but that is something that if it did get popular in our city, again, I agree it probably won't, but you could go ahead and add that kind of provision in and say, hey, you can't have one because the neighbor in the same, already one on the same block.
Just wait till we build the Ark at Wilson Park.
I thought it was an aircraft.
That too.
Yeah, that's the one I saw was the aircraft carrier was going to come in and be moved in.
So how would you regulate that? You know, these, Airbnbs.
For me, it would take me monitoring those sites for listings.
Your neighbor would have to turn it in.
And, or your neighbor would have to turn it in.
That's what happens over there.
I would guess that most of the time, that's how I'm going to discover it is the neighbor complains about it.
Right.
And I'll say, oh, that's a violation because they were supposed to get that conditional use permit to have it. And if it's a problem, then we'll shut it down. And I don't have a way to do that today. And so by putting this in here, that actually gives us a little bit more teeth without adding a ton of regulations to it.
We can always cross-reference that address on the websites.
Probably what I'll do, assuming this all gets passed through and everything, is once it gets done, I will make a tour of several of them. Certainly those three I mentioned there. and just see what all we have. I mean, I know of one for sure on Chestnut. That is not hidden at all.
Do you have an issue with making that a conditional use for all?
Conditional use means that they come before this board?
And all the neighbors, they all get letters.
Yeah, they would get notified.
Yeah, fine,
I can just change that.
I'll add that in.
Anybody else have an issue?
as long as it's conditional.
So the only place where they won't come before you is that R3 district.
Yeah.
Which, again, that's where the one I know about for sure is already in that district
I think
anyway.
there's
So.
several.
There's probably some others, I just am not as aware of them.
And I think it's wise to do this before we get to be popular.
Okay.
No, think positively before we are popular.
We're planning for the future. Remember, we did a comprehensive plan.
Yeah. Annex the peak and set the whole line.
Okay.
Typo, error.
I'd noticed that. I changed that on my copy. So it's not Airbnb, it's Airbnb. So that's really all that changes. I mean, other than I had to renumber that section because it's alphabetical order. That's why it's sitting where it is. The other section, the other thing I wanted to add into Article 6 also was mentioned in the comprehensive plan is just a little bit about tiny houses. Now, a tiny house, that's on the next page. A tiny house is a single family dwelling. However, what I saw in another city, and I kind of liked it, we have a lot of properties around town that are too small to build on. So if, and we've actually done a variance or two on this, where somebody wanted to do a lot split and they were going to leave too small of a thing. So anyways, if one of those alley houses burns down, for example, they can't be rebuilt and that parcel is totally worthless without a variance, of course. They could still ask you for a variance or ask the board of zoning appeals for a variance. So what I propose that if you can meet the regulations in a brand new section, which will be in Article 20-11, then you can put a tiny house on one of these lots. What's nice about that is that would allow us to use some of those unusable lots. They would still have to meet the setbacks. Of course, they could ask for a variance to that too, just like any other time. But it would allow somebody to put a small house on a small lot.
What defines a tiny house?
That'll be in Article 20. And so it's actually in that packet if you wanted to look at it real quick.
There it is.
Yeah. And so
Tiny house on wheels.
that is what that is, it's a kind of industry term. So the tiny house that's not on wheels is one that's just built on site. So, and a tiny house on wheels is like a manufactured home, like Skyline has those.
Yeah.
And so that's confusing, but it's an industry term. And in that section, basically it says that you could have it on a smaller lot, like a 3,000 square foot lot, I think. Actually, no, it only says that for R1. And then the R2 and it's probably not going to happen in R1 anyways, because those lots are conforming. We don't have very many in the R1 district that wouldn't meet that anyway. So it's probably not going to happen. There's also been a few cases around the country. In fact, I think Wichita had one where somebody wanted to build a subdivision of just nothing but tiny homes right across the street from like $500,000 homes. And so they had to, and they didn't have any regulations at all about it. I've seen a lot of tiny homes that are coming in.
Yes.
Tiny homes in themselves is not a problem, other than they're a little out of character and when they get placed in a standard neighborhood. But these regulations that I'm proposing really don't take that into account.
There's quite a few of them in Oregon. I see a lot of them up there. I own a place up there. And the people that live in them tend to be transient.
That's the other issue that comes up. The ones that we have in town, for the most part, I don't think they're transient. I think most of those are just somebody that wanted a really small house. However, I think one of them, the guy actually wanted to build it like that because he's a truck driver and was rarely at home. So he is transient, but he's not.
So to be classified tiny, does it have a minimum and a maximum square footage?
Doesn't really have a maximum, but it does have a minimum of 170 square foot for 170 square foot per occupant, or for the first occupant, and 100 for the rest of them.
Well, if it doesn't have a maximum, you could easily outgrow that lot. Without, you know,
Still have to stay within the set plan.
You still have to meet the setbacks, yeah.
setback, other than the setbacks, you could do it.
But then it's just considered a home.
Yeah. It's a terminology thing. I get it.
Where's the definition?
And I think,
Way back, 20-1102, just a few from the back, 3 from the back.
and I think it's wise that we do this before we get popular, because I can see someone like me winning Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes and buying vacant lots in Park City and building tiny homes on them and renting them out for white properties.
Oh, yeah, geez. That's where we'd have some issues. The other place, like I mentioned, the alley houses, but we have a number of places around town where today we have shotgun houses.
Yeah, the railroad built a bunch.
And really, in most of the cases of those shotgun houses, they wouldn't be able to be rebuilt either because they're on like 25-foot lots.
So, yeah, I own several. I don't know if you know, but I own several cute little houses.
Mhm.
They were not built well. But
No, probably not.
they were, you know, for what they were built, they had a purpose.
We still have probably several dozen of
Oh,
them
yeah.
scattered around town somewhere.
I'm so glad that they're still there and still being.
Anyways, we can kind of sit on that and we'll come back to that one next month anyways, but I don't mind having that discussion. I think that was good so that everybody understood what we're talking about. The other thing in that little footnote to that table, that to me, that last sentence that I struck out is confusing. It basically was saying that if you didn't meet those minimum lot areas, that Article 21 on non-conforming lots would govern. Well, that kind of goes without saying. Anytime something it's pre-existing and doesn't comply with the current regulations, you go to Article 21, which is non-conforming. It's non-conformance or something. I don't remember what it's called exactly. But that's the article that tells me how to handle those situations. And like, especially if somebody wants to say the structure is non-conforming and they want to add on to it. So I go to that section and it tells me how to handle it. So it's not necessary to have that in there. That wording is a little bit odd too, because if it's a separate legal lot at the time of the regulations, then yes, it would go back to Article 21. Totally unnecessary to have that there. And so I just proposed removing it. Any other concerns? Obviously, I don't have it in here. Is there anything you've noticed over the years in residential districts that have been an issue?
I have one concern. I'll probably have to push back on this, but the multi-family dwellings, duplexes that sit right in the middle of a single family neighborhood. Devaluing property, and I don't know the specifics or how true it is. Just kind of reiterating what they said. They were concerned with the amount of traffic, additional traffic, and the devalue of the surrounding property because of the amount of traffic into the house or fear of devaluing their property.
I think it's more perception than anything. As we were talking about when we were discussing that rezone on Key Largo, for past construction. One of the concerns of the neighbors was it would generate more traffic. Well, yeah, a little bit more, but so would a second single-family home on that lot. It'd be the same amount of traffic. So ultimately, that didn't get approved in that neighborhood, and probably for good reason. There was multiple reasons not to, especially the road in that case.
And is in flood zone.
Yeah, well, no, the other one
Part
was.
was, right?
That was the other one on Main
That was the
Street.
one.
But yes, that was another one. On that one, there was an issue. So that wouldn't have been a great situation in that case. But yeah, I hear the same thing sometimes, that they're concerned about traffic and
Yeah, I'm not agreeing with this. It's just voicing the concern of citizens.
that's fair. Basically, and we kind of were, well, that one was weird. I hate to even talk about that case because it was an odd one. What we have done is Pablo Fuentes has built a number of duplexes in neighborhoods that were otherwise primarily single family, but they're in that R2 district, which allows for that kind of mix of housing a little bit. And for the most part, I've not had a bunch of complaints about his properties where he did that.
Maybe we should possibly consider that conditional. I don't know. The board agrees or disagrees.
In R2 district? Let's see. So in that table, that's number 7. So the way this works, and it's R1, R2, R3. I know I cut it off on this page. So that top letter is a single family. The second row is the 2 family, and the bottom row is the 3rd one.
R2 column. The only thing we should discuss is changing that P to the C, possibly.
In R2?
Yes.
No.
That would make that the same as R1. Currently, the R1 has that C in the.
I guess that would kind of defeat the purpose of having R2 zoning.
Correct.
Right. The other goofy thing is, and I never quite know how to deal with this, let's say somebody did want to put a duplex in an R1 district. Well, it's a conditional use permit. What in the world, what are the conditions that we put on it? The good thing is it does force it to come to you and you can discuss it. I just don't, if that ever comes up, I guess we'll cross the bridge when we come to it.
But if you look at the R1 on our maps, the R1 really isn't even conducive to doing duplexes. And I mean, that's just, I don't see any investor going out there and buying up any vacant lots out there.
They're more likely to try to get an area.
The whole
rezoned.
acreage, yeah. Mhm, mhm,
Like they're a separate.
mhm.
Sounds good. Start right up.
To your point about conditional, I mean, even back to the VRBO thing. Is it just, they come in here and say, I'd like to do it, you vote, if some neighbors show up, you might vote it down, if nobody shows up, you might get it, like, are there any rules, or is it just a?
There's nothing, in that case, no, there's nothing that says what you have to do. That's discretionary. So this board would take into context the comments from the public in that case. And
Just vote on it?
I would look at it probably too to see if there was something that I thought should be added and then discuss it.
I think a lot goes into it. The condition of the house, how many neighbors show up.
Right,
I mean, there's a lot of,
right.
if no one shows up and the house looks nice, why would you say no?
Yeah, probably.
You know, I mean, there's just,
Right.
I mean, anybody who's doing VRBOs are generally going to, I mean, you're sticking your neck way out there. Because if you run your numbers in small towns, they just don't work well.
Right, they're not.
So, yeah, I mean,
And
and
become popular.
And the capacity to starting to buy, it's starting to go downhill. That trend has been maxed out this last 2 years, 3 years. So the trend is actually, people are starting to sell them
Yeah.
because they're just, the market's flooded. So,
Yeah, but it would just be a gut feel type of.
Well, we had a training course months ago. There was a packet that handed out kind of this questions and that.
So, yeah,
So we could refer back to that. So there.
I guess just the word condition, I think that there are some conditions they have to meet.
There would have to be something attached to it in order for that to go through.
Or any of the conditional permits, it's really just a.
Yeah.
Gut feel vote.
It more or less is. What happens in the ordinance when we pass the conditional use is there's a section in there that says this use is allowed on this site if the following conditions are met, and then whatever the list of conditions is listed.
We'll make up the conditions at the meeting.
Very much.
But the guidelines that gentleman laid out.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly.
Well, in our regulations, there is a section specific to conditional use. It's Article 26. And it tells you all the different things. It's the same thing we look at when we do rezone. It's a little bit different list, but it's the same sort of things we're looking at. Generally, it's the same things that citizens are going to be concerned with. Okay. Well, that's Article 6. So Article 7 was countryside district. That is the regulations for that district. And again, since we are going to remove it, we need to strike that section totally out. And again, reserve it so that we don't have to renumber the rest of the articles. If you've ever looked at, I don't know if anybody has the time to do this, but if you've ever looked at like the state statutes, like a listing of them, and if you just went down chapter by chapter, you'll see a whole bunch of them where they just reserved, because otherwise, and it's even worse for them, you may be renumbering 1,000 sections. So we just reserve it. Maybe someday there'll be another district we want to put in there. Maybe we'll put that back in there in the future. I don't know. I doubt it, but. Article 8 is public use districts, and not recommending any changes to that. That district works pretty well. Again, that district is basically government owned properties. So like on this map, the big hub is where Cali College is. And then of course there's some city facilities, and the parks are generally all there. So that's who I'm dealing with, and a lot of it is the city. So we're not going to have a whole lot of problems there. And that district is pretty lenient on setbacks and height restrictions and all that kind of stuff. So Article 9 is the commercial district, C1, C2, C3, and sort of C4. And that one I did propose a few changes, and I'm just going to go down through the table. So number 4 says any public building or land used by any department of the city of government. And when I was going through this table, I thought, well, that sounds awful a lot like number 13, electric, telephone, substations, and similar public utility uses. And yet it's more restrictive than number 13. So I thought that was a little strange. So what I proposed there was changing those conditional uses for C2 and C3 to just be permitted uses to match number 13.
Can you show us on the map which areas are C2?
Yeah,
C3?
absolutely. So here, that darkest red is C4, that's downtown. This next kind of medium red color, and you see a lot of that North Summit corridor, that's where you're going to see the most of it. That's the C3. C2 is kind of It's a little bit lighter color. So there's 4 of them, so the colors are really close together. C2 is kind of this medium shade here. The idea that C2 is that it's not quite the dense core that you see, like your Walmarts and stuff like that. A Walmart would not be in a C2. Usually you're thinking of a smaller facility, like a small restaurant or something like that. Didn't have a ton of parking, those kind of things. And then C1 is this most pale, it's almost pink. That district is really restricted to the lightest commercial uses that there are. You might see like a dentist office, for example, in one of those that it's kind of a small commercial use that doesn't have a ton of parking, doesn't have a big footprint, but also not great for a residential district. Now, we do have a dentist office in residential districts. For example, like Dr. Rogers' office is in a residential district, but that is allowed. If you went back to that table, that sort of use is allowed. So there's not a ton of difference between C1 and sort of the higher end residential uses. If residential office, we used to have a district in our old regulations that was RO, residential office. And a use like, for instance, Rogers would have been in that district. I think it was. But the way that we did that residential table in these new regulations, that wasn't required. It was just I think it was just a permitted use. Where's that? Come on, where's that at? Oh, it would have been a conditional use. So if Nick Rogers approached me today and wanted to build that dentist office where it is today in the same site, pretend it wasn't there, he would have to get a conditional use permit today. In the C1 district, you wouldn't have to do that because it already has the appropriate zoning. Is that clear as mud?
So where that pink is at Edgemont is where the church is.
Yeah, and that again, that was a
On
use.
Radio Lane, it's an empty lot at this point.
Yeah, that was that, Dr. Seitz owns that. He's been trying to sell it forever.
Yeah, for years and years.
And it's one of those, that one is kind of interesting.
Had a really neat house on it.
Did it?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because it's almost too close to the Walgreens building for residential use, but it's too close to the Highland Drive neighborhood for a commercial use. So it's kind of a limbo property, which is probably why it's been on the market for as long as it has, because nobody really knows what would fly there. So anyways, that's a difference between those. You get the more intense use as you go from C1 to C4. Now C4, of course, is a different animal, which is why it's got its own article too. It has its different set of stuff, and most of it's in the historic district, so that adds some stuff. So let's see. The next use that I kind of talked about was automobile and truck wash services, so like a car wash. That's just a funny way of describing it. For whatever reason, we left that off as C2 and we did these regulations, and I'm not sure that that's really a problem. It would be a problem in a C1 because of the traffic. And it's listed as conditional for C4, but that's really more because of the type of uses you see in C4. I've never seen a historic car wash. Maybe they exist, but a car wash would look really odd in our downtown area. And we don't have a lot of places for drive-through type uses in the downtown area. There's a few, like Union State used to have the one in the back, and then the old corner bank, the RCB bank at Chestnut, actually does have a drive-through. And then the drive-through across the street for the ATM.
whatever.
It's unusual to see drive-throughs in the downtown just because of the way the buildings are all put together. And the car wash is definitely the same.
How far does that dense red go?
The darkest,
Yeah,
it just goes up to Walnut and then it switches over to the C3. And then the other way, it goes down to Madison.
so.
So yeah, Reiki's, for instance, would be in the C3.
Yeah.
But Summit Realty is C4. Okay. Number 8 is kind of an oddball one. That regulation, that's a consultant error, as far as I can tell. That referenced a footnote that doesn't make any sense for our regulations. Number 2 originally had to do with church parsonages. And it said that if you're in that district, that you had to have the same floor area regulations that's listed in item number 12 of table 9.1. Well, if you look at item number 12, there is no such thing. So what happened was that came from another set of regulations and was just left over. We don't define a church parsonage any different than another single family residence in that district. So it's not necessary to have that listed. I'm not aware of any anyways. There's been some churches kind of off and on in the downtown area. In fact, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. There is some of the churches in the downtown area are in the C4 district. First Baptist, Central Christian, Presbyterian Church, I think is too. So I don't know if any of them have parsonages or not. But anyways, it doesn't matter. All that is me just cleaning that language up because it doesn't apply to us. And I've just never noticed it in the past. Which makes sense because it never came up. Let's see. Number 26, mini storage, self-storage. If you remember from last month, we got rid of Article 13 of the subdivision regulations related to site plan review. Some of that is going to go into Article 29 of the zoning regulations, which we'll get to next month. But there was a couple of design requirements that I think fit better in the district section so that you actually see it. And so today you see that mini storage, self-storage is a conditional use in those 3 districts, but you don't know that there's additional regulations somewhere else. Well, what this does is puts that footnote in there, which refers you to 9-602. And that's in there. It's on the next couple pages later. All that 9-602 is right out of Article 13 of the subdivision regulations. I don't know that I changed a single word in there unless it was a grammatical thing. I don't think so. And so that's all that does. So it just draws their attention to the fact that there are special regulations for those kind of buildings.
Then how does, in 26, any storage, self-storage, and we have no conditional use in C1, what prevents me from buying a self-storage trailer and parking it on my property and using it for a marijuana grow facility? We've talked about this before.
That would be a different use.
You don't know it until you open it.
Right, but it would be a violation immediately. If it was a use that was not permitted by our regulations, then it would be a zoning violation and basically they would be required to stop the operation immediately. I've had a few of those where it was a use that wasn't allowed in that district. And so I had to go in and say, you can't do that anymore here. And then I'd give them a remedy, like you can apply for a rezone or a variance or whatever the case needed to be.
Right.
But that's how I would address an issue like that.
So at this point, you can't live in a residential area, you can't live in a fifth wheel or anything like that.
Right. Now, that's not directly defined, but it's also not permitted either. It's not listed as a permitted use.
And my comfort level would go up if there was a C in that block.
Why?
What? You don't want that.
You don't want
Right
it
now,
there.
it's not allowed at all. If you put a C in there, then it's up for review.
Yeah, if it's
Okay.
blank, it's
Yeah.
not allowed at
Yeah,
all. You
not
can't
allowed.
even come before the planning commission and ask for it. You could, I guess you could come before the planning commission and ask for an amendment,
Yes.
but, okay, so you ask for the amendment to get a conditional use, then you have to wait until it gets approved, and then you have to come back and get a conditional use permit too, go through it again. So it's, anybody could do that process, but it's
They can.
painful. And it's supposed to be painful. It should, if it's a use that's not permitted, it needs to go through the full review process. And if they're forcing us to do a zoning amendment, then we're going to make them go through the process.
Can you show the south side of Lexington?
And this is the reason that dashed line is there is this is my proposed one that I'm going to talk about in more detail next time. So that's,
So what about with Skyline Parks and stuff?
Well, they do, yeah.
that is, it's
very-
right here. It's in that commercial district. I think that's going to stop when Skyline expands. I don't know that for a fact, but I think that's going to stop happening. That's what I've heard, rumors.
So they're renting space, parking space from them.
He owns it. The guy that's doing that owns that
Skyline.
property. It's not Skyline. It's one of their contractors that delivers them.
Well, originally, it was supposed to be all gravel.
It was supposed to be a dealership. He's probably violating. If I really crack down on him, I could probably get him to totally remove them. It's one of those you choose your battles cases.
Ask them to do what they say they're going to do. So they put gravel.
So when there's a code violation pertaining to something like, I don't know, fifth wheel, is that your bailiwick? Is that Mike Mills?
Technically for that, it's mine, but we usually kind of team up on how we enforce it. Because it's a code violation. So, but yes, it's my responsibility to ultimately to make sure that any violation is taken care of. So let's see, the next one that I touched was number 29. That was regarding motor vehicle repair and body shops. And then it says that all the work has to be performed inside the building, and got some that kind of stretch that. For the most part, that we don't have a lot of that, but it happens sometimes. What I did here was I'm kind of loosening it up based on what's happened currently. There's a couple places, like Bulldog Tire, for instance. It was pre-existing and we zoned it C2 when we did the free zone back in 2014, and it was existing before that even. And so technically, I mean, it's not conforming, so it doesn't matter. It fits into that. But some of those areas either need to be rezoned to C3. That one probably does need to be rezoned to C3. Or this change that I propose needs to be made. So like this section right in here, we did a C2 district and I don't know exactly where that is on there. Oh, it's down here. It's where that shop is. Trying to,
Scooters is gonna be,
where the Jiffy Lube used to be. Oh, somebody has a question.
Scooters.
Scrooge is going to be north of it.
Right next door.
It'll still be there. They're not moving. Now, however, where Scooters is proposed to go, they used to have some of their operations over there. Bulldog did. They already don't have operations there now, but they did at one time. They're just shrinking back into that old Jiffy Lube building. But basically, what I did was that they were conditional uses before in C2 and C3, which I don't know. To me, auto repair shop in a C3 district just should be permitted. That seems a little too restrictive to me. Obviously, yes, they need to control how many cars are on the lot, and they need to do the repairs inside the garage. But the thing about that is, and part of the reason I feel this way is even, say, Zellers, for example, if a brand new car dealership went into a C3 district and they wanted to have, and most dealerships do, repairs, they would have to get a conditional use permit in order to do that. It seems a little excessive because it's already a big sea of cars because it's a car dealership. But it would, under these regulations, that wouldn't be permitted. It would be a conditional use, but it wouldn't be permitted. And so that's why I propose to kind of loosen that up. And then also in this, I guess I read that wrong. In the C2 district, make that a conditional use permit. C1, no, I don't think it's appropriate to have a car repair shop in a little office district because usually those are next to residential, pretty close. And we have a few like that, like lunch mechanics or however you lunch money mechanics. That one is kind of in that area. But again, that was a pre-existing. It wasn't lunch money, but it was something else. But it was a car lot sort of thing. Let's see. And the last change that I proposed was to package liquor stores. The way it was before is they were conditional use permit in C2, C3, and C3-4. What I did instead of having that, or this is my proposal, is to add a footnote, and the footnote number 4 already exists for some other things. Basically, the condition, and this is probably what would come up anyways with the liquor store, if it was a conditional use permit, it came before you, is that they would have to be 200 feet from a church, a school, or a hospital. I don't know why hospital's on the list, but the idea is to keep them spaced away from those other two uses. Obviously from schools because of the influence the liquor store has on young kids. That's what you're going to hear. If we had one come as a conditional use permit, the first thing that's going to come up is that's too close to a school or whatever. We went through that when what's the name of that club? The club that's up on North Summit. That church across the street is more than 200 feet away. The entrance is, and that's how you define it. And so that came up, but it didn't become an issue because it met the guidelines. So I guess the question is 200 feet far enough, but that's how it's written. That's pretty normal language. The state kind of uses 200-foot rule for some of their stuff too. It's pretty normal. Basically, though, what changes there is they don't have to do a conditional use permit. They just have to make sure they meet that 200 foot in the C3 and C4. Now, that could mean too that a church decides to open up when they hear about a liquor store opening up. It can happen, but then it's whoever's there first. And then I just added it to the C2 as a footnote again, but it doesn't change anything other than that. The only other change to this table is the footnote there. Again, I removed that reference to percentages because it doesn't apply. And in this case, I added that 9-602, which again, that's the mini storage, self-storage. So that's the only thing to change there. So the other thing in Article 9 is the yard table or the setback table, whatever you want to call it, and just remove C4. It's all zeros anyways. And C4 has its own section on setbacks, which is actually 0, but it is in Article 10. So not a real change there. It's confusing. And that funny little footnote there, that doesn't make any sense because they're supposed to be 0, no matter how tall it is. 9-601, I haven't talked about that yet. That is just some more of those development standards that used to be or that is today, in Article 13 of the subdivision regulations. So it talks about the requirements that you have to meet when you're bringing in a new business in a commercial district. So like, for instance, rooftop equipment has to be screened. So there's several others there. None of these are new because we have them in the subdivision regulations today. This is just moving them over. And if it looks new, that's all the more reason for us to put it in this section, in my opinion.
Where does footnote 1 pertain to? It looks like something for animals. But I see a footnote, but I don't see anywhere used. I see the other footnotes used. I don't see that one.
Number 3, animal hospitals.
Okay, thank you.
I had to look too. But I'm glad. I thought for a second that was not right either. But
Yeah, I see it.
so it's kind of like a condition to put an animal hospital in. It has to meet.
Makes sense.
So the only other thing in 9 is that 602, which we already talked about. That's the mini storage, self-storage section. Any questions about commercial districts? Well, I guess we technically still have another commercial district to talk about. Article 10 is basically it's extra regulations for the C4 district. This could be handled in Article 9, but when the regulations were written, it was separated out. It could be argued either way. It works. The only change that I'm making is to change that to where it says no off-street parking spaces shall be required of any use in the C4 district. Before that regulation, it said that dwellings had to have parking, but that doesn't really make sense. Why is that one use singled out for required parking? On Summit Street, that would be impossible because there's nowhere for you to put off-street parking. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to require it just for that one use. And it also conflicts with 22-201, which says no off-street parking shall be required in the C4 district. It doesn't say anything about dwellings in that statement. So I just thought that needed to be removed just because, quite frankly, I didn't even realize it was in there. And so we've been trying to promote upper floor housing along Summit Street, and that would make that a lot more difficult. Or they would have to have, the only other way to do it would be for them to have designated spots in the public lots, which we really don't want to go that route either. That's just easier not to enforce it like that. And then the places in the C4 district that are not actually along the Summit Street corridor, there's not very many of those where it's going to affect it. The churches, for instance, have parking. Some parking. I guess it depends where you're at. Now, if you've ever been downtown on a Sunday morning, can be an interesting challenge to find parking. I'm not downtown because my church is up north, but I've heard that it can get kind of interesting on a Sunday morning. But there's a lot of parking that's public parking. So there's that. So Articles 11 through 14. So we're moving through these real fast now. None of those need to have any changes. Those are manufactured home subdivision, the elderly housing overlay district, the manufactured home park, and the housing opportunity overlay. None of them really needed changes. If you want to know what those are, check your binder and read through that, see what's in those, but I don't propose any changes to those. Article 15 is the industrial districts. And the big thing I wanted to change here, I never understood this, and I've struggled with this for the last 10 years or 9 years. A lot of the uses in the table, for some reason, are more restrictive in the I2 than they are in the I1. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out why an airplane hangar needs to be a conditional use in an I2, but it's permitted in the I1 district. I don't know why it was written like that originally.
Can you show us where these are relative?
Yeah, since we've been doing that, let's do it. So obviously the north end is the Golf Industrial Park. So it's all I2. The dark purple and the light, this is the I1. So this is for some of these slightly lighter industrial uses that don't take as much space up as, say, a Creekstone. Creekstone would definitely not fit in an I1 district. So in this area, this is the shop yard for Evergy and Kansas Gas. So it kind of needed that. This is that, I don't even know if it's operating right now, but it used to be Sign Solutions, or is I can't remember what the name of that company was. Winfield Consumer Products, I think is what was in there, actually. And then some of this is Skyline. Dad's self-storage is in this, right in there. There's also Frito-Lay has their little warehouse that's in there. So warehouses, small warehouses can be in that district. Let's see where else we've got industrial. Lithco over here. The only reason that that's zoned the way it is because it's pre-existing. That probably would not get its proper zoning today. I would assume y'all wouldn't want an industrial district in the middle of a residential, but it's zoned like that because they're pre-existing and it just makes it easier. Ian's place is also an I1. Mostly the reason that was done, it probably been 15 years ago, that his dad wanted to have some outdoor storage, and I think the city was giving him some grief about it, if I remember right. You might remember it, but anyways, that was rezoned. Yeah, let's see, I can't remember. At the time when this was zoned like this, that's where Patrick Suttles had his operations. It's still similar operations in that area. There's Boxman owns it today. There's some other warehouse type buildings that are along this side. Keith Veendahl has these properties, and again, it was an outdoor storage thing. That's why those got rezoned. Let's see. And then of course there's the Madison corridor. Several things over here. Skyline has their one warehouse there, and I don't even know what's being done here. It's not used real heavily, but it's kind of industrial uses. This is where A to Z recycling was, or still is. I don't even know today. ADM, the other ADM over there. There's Campac is of course kind of an oddball too. But again, it's been there for 100 years, so it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon, and so it just seems appropriate. This is also pre-existing warehouse, and of course, it's right next to the railroad tracks, so that's not that's hard to see that. And then, of course, the only other one, this is Bruton's operations. So again, there's on the table, I think pretty much the only thing I changed was that same scenario where I feel that the I2 should be less restrictive than the I1. And so that's what all of that does. It just makes it a little less restrictive. I think, go ahead.
The one on Pierce, West Pierce, the purple on West Pierce,
Mhm.
that's a storage yard for Bruton, isn't it?
Mhm.
That's odd. Residential, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's odd. But that's also one of those that's been there since 40s or 50s, way before I was born.
Just a question. Why does the line cross the river into the opposing shore?
I've always wondered that. I have no idea. I think it's something to do with the levee, but that doesn't make sense. So I don't know why that's it. Now, it may be a leftover because once upon a time, there was just a little bit of this property down here that was annexed. I think it was really short term, like maybe less than a year. But at one time, part of this area was inside the city.
Okay.
Maybe it's left over from that. I really don't know.
It looks strange.
Technically, it would mean that re-annexing this would be easier, but I think that could fall flat on its face in court. Because it doesn't make sense that the city would annex the river.
Well,
Because it's a federal river, it's not even a private one, so it's a navigable waterway by
yeah,
federal definition.
only when there's water in
When there's water.
it.
Yeah, it's not really navigable, but it still has that federal designation.
Yeah.
And so I think it would get thrown out in court if we tried that. But yeah, other than that, I don't know why it's like that. Beyond that, there is a footnote again for self-storage, mini storage number 24, doing the same thing that it was in commercial. Because we moved the self-storage regulations into this district, it's just a footnote that points your attention to the fact that it's there. Before, probably what should have been there was a reference to subdivision Article 13. It probably should have been in there to help people see it. But that's why that's put back in there. Again, the regulations here for those facilities are largely untouched. There's a little bit of different wording because we refer to these as self-storage, mini storage, and then in the commercial one, it was also mini storage. And so I made an attempt to kind of bring those all into the same thing. They're all the same thing, but they're just referred to a little bit different. They're interchangeable terms. And so in paragraph C, I attempted to do that. So any other concerns for industrial districts? So Article 16 and 17 are the planned unit development and the college overlay districts, neither of which have been used. We could probably make the argument to get rid of college because not ever done a master plan, which is what would be required. I don't think it hurts to have that district there. PUD will eventually have that. What people would use that district for is sort of a mixed use subdivision might need it. I could see it used in like Brandon's development if it was divided up a little differently. The other time you might use it, of course, it's all on property, so it doesn't matter for you, but it could have been used there. The other place you would see that is if you have connected townhomes. So if we had row houses, a neighborhood of row houses, there's no district that allows that because it's zero setback of a party wall. And so they would have to use a PUD in order to do it. So we don't want to get rid of that. We just have never had a request for it. So finally, this is taking longer than I thought. I talked too much. Is the mixed use district. And if you recall, we've had some issues with mixed use.
Stop.
If you want to stop, I'm fine with that.
I know that four was at 7:30, so
Okay.
that's okay with you.
No problem. I think this is a good stopping point. We'll pick this up next month with mixed use. We also will do supplemental regulations, that's number 20. Sign regulations, and a couple other minor things. So I appreciate the input and the discussion tonight. I think it's been pretty good.
I'll also mention that in research, the meeting at 7:30.
Yeah, he said that just now.
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry. I didn't.
Oh, I would recommend.
I would also encourage, if you have any interest at all, to attend the meeting on Thursday
Yes.
about the sales tax.
It'll be in this one.
And streamed. It will be streamed.
Second.
All signify with aye.